in 1904, Maud rolls onto the scene. It is 100% adhesion. It has a shallow firebox and a standard boiler. Now granted, Maud did spend her first few months of existence on display in St. Louis, but even so, it's still a surprise that it took until 1906 for other roads to embrace the articulated concept. And when those roads did, they ordered Baldwin 2662 locomotives of very similar designs. Save for being the heaviest locomotives of the day, those Baldwin 2662s were quite straightforward. Compared to more modern types, they lacked combustion chambers because Baldwin and their client roads felt that the cost of building and maintaining such wasn't worth the effort, and they lacked superheaters because that technology was still fairly nascent and lubricants were still animal-based. Pretty much those Baldwin 2662s were moored with trailing and leading axles added, and during that time period, Mauds and Super Mauds were being built in reasonable numbers. And whilst articulateds would grow into massive beasts like this particular example, those early 2662s were the foundation for the evolution that followed, and included in all of that were the successes, the failures, the compromises implicit in articulated locomotives. Like Maud, those 1906 Baldwins had shallow fireboxes, so the trailing axles weren't Passchendaele or Atlantic or Prairie type, they were more Santa Fe type. That's not a surprise, they were conceived of as banking locomotives. So forward during one aspect of your duties, reverse during the other aspect to pick up the next assignment. We do see some trailing axle less articulated locomotives during this time period. 2660s from whichever road I'm now showing you a photo of. 2680s, which tends to be a Great Northern application, but also on occasions other roads. And 2880s, more common, such as these on the Union Pacific. Collectively, those trailing axle, less articulated wheel arrangements were nowhere near as common as the 2662s. Those ending in zero wheel arrangements were an acknowledgement that the shift away from 100% adhesion had impacts on the weight carried by the forward engine and thus its adhesive weight. If we look at this Denver and Rio Grande example, we can see 2 out of the 3 points of weight transfer. The third is the hinge, located roughly equidistant between the trailing axle of the lead engine and the lead axle of the trailing engine. As articulated locomotives got bigger, the issue of heat production in the shallow firebox became a live one. Subsequent to Maud, Alco tended to favour the use of a shallow firebox coupled with a combustion chamber, and that approach has utility both with shorter and longer wheelbase locomotives. When Alco did build with a deep and wide firebox, the use of a combustion chamber helped to add length to the boiler assembly, thus it helped to provide weight over the forward engine. And that weight forward is an issue because when you put a wider, deeper firebox behind the rear driving wheels, it drags the whole firebox, boiler, smoke box assembly backwards and can, if not managed, significantly affect the weight available on that front engine. Baldwin, however, did not like the idea of the combustion chamber adjacent to firebox, so they went their own way when it came to long wheelbase locomotives and/or deep and wide firebox locomotives. And things with their designs got interesting quick, because instead of combustion chambers in front of the firebox, they went for what was called jointed boilers that included an intermediate combustion chamber. A combustion chamber from steam days as we know it commonly today is an extension to the firebox. It therefore increases the volume of the firebox and allows the fire to more fully develop, thus generating greater heat. It also has the advantage of increasing the top area of the furnace, above which is the area that generates the greatest amount of steam. By contrast, an intermediate combustion chamber is simply something that didn't work. When we get to 1909, we see the first 2882 locomotives hitting the market, and that wheel arrangement would become the second most common behind the 2662s. Outwardly, those early examples, if you squint your eyes a bit, look like a predecessor to the Y6b, but in reality, those Baldwin locomotives were different because they used the jointed boiler. Jointed because the front section could be disjointed and removed for maintenance purposes, the rear section being the boiler proper that generated steam, the front section being a bit of a misnomer because it contained the superheater and or reheater and or feed water heater depending on the locomotive, depending on the road. That arrangement certainly helped to keep weight forward, but the patented game wasn't worth the candle. By way of example, there are of course numerous Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe railway locomotives that illustrate the lack of utility, but also by way of example, there were other roads that used the jointed boilers. Back to Santa Fe, and the thought process on this particular locomotive is higher drivers to give a higher road speed. That meant a higher steam demand, which was served by a wider and deeper firebox with its greater ability to create heat. The fact that those drivers are much higher than literally every other articulated from that time period means that its wheelbase stretches out far more than it would if it was a low-drivered freight drag locomotive. With a quote-end quote normal boiler, the smoke box would have been about here, and if we transpose that onto our Denver and Rio Grande example that we saw previously, you'll see that that has an impact on just how much weight is transferred to that lead engine. So we can see through that illustration that Baldwin needed that extra length and extra weight given by its jointed boiler arrangement. The explanation as to why Baldwin thought that that complication inherent in a jointed boiler would have required less maintenance than, say, a normal combustion chamber is lost in the mists of time. Mostly the Baldwin jointed boilers were done rigidly and via new construction, and when combined with low drivers, the locomotives returned a reasonable period of service to their roads. Infamously, there were some examples with a flexible jointed boiler, and it's probably these that we're most aware of because they are visually notorious. Experience quickly showed that the extra utility of having that flexible boiler forward, fully supported by the flexible frame forward, wasn't worth the maintenance and the considerable downtime. During that time period, there was also the use of what today we would call expansion packs, whereby you take a perfectly useful locomotive, place the lead components of the jointed boiler and a lead frame in front of it, and turn it into a much less useful locomotive. There's an early example on the Erie where a 280 was turned into a 2680, and as soon as workshop capacity allowed, it was converted back into a single rather than articulated locomotive. The Great Northern tried the same thing with one of their Wadu types. There's some mixed mail as to how long it lasted in service. Some sources say not very long at all, others say a decade and a half. But the point to be gleaned from this is that those locomotives where one was expanded or morphed into an articulated did not last even remotely as long as articulated locomotives built from the rails up. And that's despite, or perhaps because of, the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe experience of embracing that idea on a grand scale. And by way of illustration with that grand scale, on the one hand we have the AT&SF, and on the other we have the Virginian with the same wheel arrangement. Now granted, there's a reasonable period of time between the introduction of the one and the other, but on the AT&SF it goes like this. And if this isn't the best animation you've seen this month, then I don't know what's up. Water starts in the tender. It's piped forward to the feed water heater for preheating. It's then injected into the boiler and boiled to become saturated steam. It's then subject to the superheater. As superheated steam, it is expended into high pressure cylinders, then piped through a reheat to dry out the steam as much as possible, before as low pressure steam it's expended in the low pressure cylinders and exhausted up the chimney. The Alco-built Virginian, by contrast, is simply firebox, combustion chamber, boiler, superheater, in an arrangement that was prevalent, ubiquitous throughout the final 3 or 4 decades of the steam era. By way of Alco Baldwin comparison, in Norfolk and Western bought 5 supermords from Alco and 5 jointed boiler 2882s from Baldwin, ran them against each other. The Alco significantly outperformed the Baldwin in all respects except for tracking and riding. By at least 1911, Alco were using combustion chambers and Schmidt superheaters. Norfolk and Western actually borrowed one of those locomotives for comparison purposes with the 2 I mentioned previously. And the superheated 2662 locomotive significantly outperformed the non-superheated supermord. And that experience on the Norfolk and Western caused them to purchase a whole heap of those Alco 2662s, and that became the genesis of the Y6b. Because as good as the 2662s were, the 2882 with superheater and combustion chamber was a much more potent combination. So the Y1 jointed boiler Baldwin gave way to the Y2 Alco locomotive. That informed the USRA and the Y3, which begat the Y4, Y5, Y6, Y6A, Y6b. Now that Y progression on the Norfolk Western is a progression of first tier road locomotives. And as each subsequent type was introduced, the previous types were more likely to be relegated to secondary duty. And that in fact happened with the Supermord and the Y1. The Supermords received superheaters as a retrofit and then were assigned for another decade or so to yard duty. The Y1 with the jointed boiler, exactly the same age as the Supermords, were scrapped. And that process of scrapping, carried out in the early to mid 1920s, is the line drawn underneath those Baldwin jointed boiler locomotives. But in reality, their lack of utility had been shown at least a decade earlier than that. There you go, by way of compare and contrast. That's an evolution from Maud through to the 2 most prevalent wheel arrangements in North American articulated locomotives. All right, like, subscribe, enjoy. Cheers.